My name is Jessica Martinez, and when my father collapsed from a heart attack at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the last thing on my mind was work. But when I called my supervisor at 6 a.m. from the hospital to tell her I needed bereavement leave for his funeral, she actually said the words that still make my blood boil: "Can't you just do a virtual viewing and work from home? We really need you to show leadership right now." What she didn't know was that my father had spent 40 years as a union mechanic, and he'd taught me something about workers' rights that would completely destroy her career and transform mine forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose my story really begins 6 years ago when I first walked through the revolving glass doors of Pinnacle Financial Services on West Adams Street in downtown Chicago. I was 26 then, fresh from Northwestern with my MBA, wearing my best interview suit and carrying dreams bigger than my student loan debt. The building itself was one of those gleaming towers that made you feel important just for having a keycard to get inside. 43 floors of marble lobbies, panoramic city views, and the kind of corporate prestige that looked impressive on LinkedIn profiles. Pinnacle specialized in investment management for high-net-worth clients, which was a fancy way of saying we helped rich people get richer. My role as a marketing coordinator meant I was responsible for creating campaigns that would attract even more wealthy clients to our growing portfolio. The work itself wasn't particularly meaningful, but the salary was good, the benefits were decent, and most importantly, it felt stable in a way that my childhood never had. You see, I grew up in Pilsen, a neighborhood on Chicago's southwest side where my father Miguel worked as a union mechanic at Rodriguez Auto Repair for nearly 4 decades. Dad never made much money, but he was proud of his work and fiercely protective of his rights as a laborer. Our little apartment above Mrs. Chen's grocery store wasn't much to look at, but it was home. Mom passed away from cancer when I was in college, and since then, it had just been Dad and me navigating life together. When I got the job at Pinnacle, Dad was so proud he actually cried. He kept a copy of my business card in his wallet and would show it to anyone who'd listen. "My daughter Jessica," he'd say with this huge grin, "she's got an office downtown with her name on the door." It wasn't technically true. I shared a cubicle with 3 other coordinators, but I never corrected him. Seeing his pride in my success was worth more than any corner office. The thing about corporate life that nobody warns you about is how easy it becomes to lose yourself in the rhythm of it all. Monday morning meetings where everyone pretended last week's crisis was actually productive progress. Tuesday strategy sessions that somehow never resulted in actual strategies. Wednesday deadline panics that could have been avoided with basic planning. Thursday client calls where we promised the impossible, and Friday afternoons spent figuring out how to deliver it. I became excellent at this corporate theater. I learned to speak in buzzwords and acronyms, to nod enthusiastically during presentations about synergy and paradigm shifts, to craft emails that said nothing while sounding incredibly important. My colleagues started calling me their secret weapon, because I had this ability to salvage campaigns that were falling apart and somehow make our chaotic department look professional to the outside world. But the truth was, I was running from something I didn't want to acknowledge. The more successful I became at Pinnacle, the more distance grew between me and the life I'd left behind in Pilsen. Dad and I went from talking every day to maybe once a week, usually just quick check-ins about bills or practical matters. I told myself I was too busy, too focused on building my career, too important to spend time on long conversations about his day-to-day routine. My typical week at Pinnacle started at 7:30 a.m. and rarely ended before 8 p.m. I'd grab coffee from the expensive place in the lobby, check emails that had accumulated overnight, and dive into whatever crisis needed immediate attention. The Morrison account was our biggest client, a hedge fund that managed billions in assets, and keeping them happy required constant vigilance. Every campaign had to be perfect, every presentation had to exceed expectations, and every deadline was treated like a matter of life and death. I lived in a studio apartment in River North, close enough to walk to work when the weather was decent. The rent consumed nearly half my salary, but being able to say I lived downtown felt worth the financial strain. My social life revolved entirely around work colleagues and networking events. Friday happy hours at trendy bars where we'd decompress from the week by complaining about clients and gossiping about office politics. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was working 80-hour weeks to afford a lifestyle I never had time to enjoy. My apartment was beautifully decorated with furniture I'd bought online but rarely had time to appreciate. My closet was full of professional clothes for a life that felt increasingly hollow. I had a gym membership I used maybe twice a month, and subscriptions to streaming services I never watched. What disturbed me most was how natural it all felt. The longer I stayed at Pinnacle, the more normal it seemed to prioritize work over everything else. Missing family gatherings because of client emergencies. Canceling plans with friends because a presentation needed last-minute revisions. Checking emails during movies, responding to texts during dinner, thinking about campaigns while trying to fall asleep. Dad would call on Sunday mornings, and I'd find myself getting impatient when he wanted to chat about his week. "I'm kind of busy, Papa," I'd say, even though I was usually just catching up on work or doing laundry. "Can we talk later?" But later never came, and eventually, those Sunday calls became shorter and less frequent. I told myself this was temporary, that once I got promoted to senior coordinator or maybe even marketing director, I'd have more control over my schedule and could better balance work and family. It's funny how we lie to ourselves about these things, creating elaborate justifications for choices we know aren't serving us. My colleagues at Pinnacle were nice enough people, but our relationships never went deeper than surface-level camaraderie. We'd bond over shared frustrations about unrealistic deadlines or difficult clients, but we rarely talked about our lives outside the office. Everyone seemed to be playing the same game, trying to prove their dedication through long hours and constant availability. The company culture at Pinnacle was built around the idea that we were all part of something important, that managing wealthy people's investments was somehow meaningful work that justified the sacrifices we made. We had motivational posters about excellence and teamwork, quarterly meetings where executives talked about our mission and values, annual retreats where we did trust exercises and goal-setting workshops. But underneath all that corporate messaging was a simpler truth. We were expected to put the company's needs above our own, always and without question. Taking sick days was discouraged unless you were literally hospitalized. Using vacation time during busy periods was seen as a lack of commitment. And asking for any kind of accommodation or flexibility was career suicide. I learned these unwritten rules gradually, through observation and occasional painful experience. The colleague who left early for her daughter's school play and was passed over for promotion. The guy who took a long weekend for his wedding anniversary and found himself excluded from important projects. The woman who asked to work from home when her mother was sick and was quietly pushed out within 6 months. So I adapted. I became the employee who never said no, who always volunteered for extra work, who made herself indispensable through sheer availability. I convinced myself this was what success looked like, that sacrificing my personal life was the price of professional achievement. Looking back now, I can see how completely I'd bought into a system designed to exploit my dedication. But at the time, it felt like I was building something important, climbing a ladder that would eventually lead to security and fulfillment. I had no idea that everything I thought I understood about loyalty and commitment was about to be tested in the most devastating way possible. The weekend before my father's heart attack, I worked both Saturday and Sunday on a presentation for the Morrison account. Dad called on Sunday morning like he always did, and I let it go to voicemail because I was too focused on perfecting slide transitions. I told myself I'd call him back later, but I got caught up in formatting charts and forgot until it was too late in the evening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That missed call would haunt me for months afterward, not because it was the last time he tried to reach me, but because it perfectly captured how completely I'd prioritized work over the people who actually mattered. I was so busy building a career that I was missing the life happening right in front of me. If I could go back and tell my younger self anything, it would be this: the company that demands your soul in exchange for a paycheck is never worth the price. But sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what actually has value. And sometimes, the people we think we're too busy for are the ones who end up saving us when we need it most. Everything started to change on a rainy Thursday morning in March when I was rushing to catch the blue line to work. I'd overslept after staying up until 2 a.m. working on revisions to a client proposal, and my phone was already buzzing with urgent messages from the office. The rain was coming down harder than the weather app had predicted, and I was mentally calculating whether I could still make it to the 8:30 a.m. meeting with the Morrison account team if I caught the next train. That's when my phone rang with Dad's name on the caller ID. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail because I was already running late and couldn't afford any more delays. But something made me answer, maybe guilt over how many of his calls I'd been avoiding lately. "Mija," his voice sounded different somehow, softer and more deliberate than usual. "I know you're probably rushing to work, but I wanted to catch you before your day got crazy." I was still walking quickly toward the train station, juggling my umbrella, purse, and phone while trying not to slip on the wet sidewalk. "Hey Papa, what's up? I'm actually running really late for this important meeting." "I won't keep you long," he said, and I could hear something in his tone that made me slow down a little. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm proud of you, Jessica. Really proud. I know your job is demanding and you're working so hard to build something good for yourself. I stopped walking entirely. In all my years of hurried conversations and rushed goodbyes, Dad had never called just to say he was proud of me. Usually our calls were about practical things, bills that needed paying, or appointments he needed help scheduling. That's really sweet, Papa, but is everything okay? You sound different. He laughed, that warm chuckle that always reminded me of lazy Sunday mornings when I was little. Everything's fine, Mija. I've just been thinking a lot lately about how fast time goes by. Your mother always used to say that pride should be spoken out loud, not just felt in your heart. So I'm speaking it out loud. I felt tears prick at my eyes, standing there on the corner of Clark and Lake while commuters rushed past me toward the train station. When was the last time someone had called me just to say they were proud of me? When was the last time I'd taken 5 minutes to really listen to my father's voice without mentally composing work emails while he talked? I love you too, Papa, I said, and for the first time in months, I meant it with my full attention. Good, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Now go to your important meeting and knock them dead. But Jessica, promise me something. What's that? Promise me you'll call me this weekend. Not just a quick check-in, but a real conversation. I want to hear about your life, not just your work. I want to know who my daughter is becoming. I promised him I would, and for the rest of that day, his words stayed with me. During the Morrison meeting, while I was presenting quarterly performance metrics, I kept thinking about his voice and the way he'd said my name. During lunch at my desk, scrolling through endless emails, I found myself wondering what Dad was doing with his Thursday afternoon. That Saturday, I actually kept my promise. Instead of spending the weekend catching up on work projects, I drove to Pilsen to visit Dad at his apartment. It was the first time I'd been there in almost 3 months, and I was shocked by how different the place looked. The walls that had been bare since Mom died were now covered with photographs and certificates. The kitchen table that used to be stacked with mail and newspapers was clear and set for two, like he'd been expecting me. Tell me everything, he said as we sat down with coffee and the churros he'd bought from the panaderia down the street. And I mean everything. Not the work stuff, the real stuff. What makes you happy? What keeps you up at night? What do you dream about when you're not thinking about spreadsheets and presentations? I started to give him the standard update about my job, but he held up his hand. Mija, I didn't ask about your work. I asked about you. It was such a simple distinction, but it stopped me cold. When was the last time someone had asked about me as a person rather than me as an employee? When was the last time I'd even thought about myself as anything other than a marketing coordinator at Pinnacle Financial Services? So I told him the truth. I told him about feeling lonely in my expensive apartment, about friendships that revolved entirely around work, about Sunday mornings when I woke up and couldn't remember what I used to enjoy doing for fun. I told him about the promotion I'd been promised that kept getting delayed, about the way Amanda made me feel like I was never quite good enough, about the constant anxiety that if I stopped working 80-hour weeks, someone younger and hungrier would take my place. Dad listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally and refilling my coffee when the cup got empty. When I finally finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment. You know what I hear when you talk about your job, he said finally. What? I hear someone who's forgotten that work is supposed to serve your life, not the other way around. You've got it backwards, Mija. He told me about his week, about volunteering at the Pilsen Community Center where he'd started teaching kids how to repair bicycles. He showed me pictures on his phone of children clustered around old bikes, their faces serious with concentration as he demonstrated how to adjust brake cables and patch inner tubes. These kids, he said, scrolling through the photos, they come from families where nobody has money to fix things when they break. So they just throw them away and do without. But I'm teaching them that almost everything can be repaired if you know how and you're willing to be patient. I watched him talk about those kids, saw the way his whole face lit up when he described their excitement over getting an old bike running again. This was a version of my father I'd never seen before, someone who'd found purpose and joy in retirement, rather than just filling time until the next doctor's appointment. Papa, I said, you seem so happy. I am happy, he said simply. For the first time since your mother died, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. That afternoon, he insisted on taking me to the community center to meet some of the kids he'd been telling me about. The building was old and needed updating, but it was full of life and energy. Kids were everywhere, playing basketball in the gym, working on art projects in the classroom, clustered around Dad's makeshift bike repair station in what used to be a storage room. Mr. Miguel, a little girl named Sophia, ran up to us. I rode my bike to school every day this week, just like you taught me. I watched Dad's face as he knelt down to Sophia's level, asking her detailed questions about how the gears were shifting, and whether she remembered to check her tire pressure. This was parenting energy he'd never had the chance to use with grandchildren, mentorship skills he'd never been able to develop in his years as a mechanic focused on just getting cars fixed. And customers out the door. On the drive home that evening, I kept thinking about the contrast between Dad's obvious fulfillment and my own growing sense of emptiness. He was making $20 an hour as a part-time volunteer coordinator, but he talked about his work with more passion than I'd ever felt about campaigns that generated millions in revenue. "Mija," he said as I was getting ready to leave, "you don't have to keep living like this. You're smart enough and talented enough to write your own rules. It's not that simple, Papa. You don't understand how competitive it is in corporate America." "Maybe not," he said, "but I understand what it looks like when someone's spirit is getting crushed slowly. And I understand that no job is worth sacrificing your humanity." That night, driving back to my apartment in River North, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to start saying no. Not to everything, but to the things that didn't actually matter. I was going to stop checking emails after 9 p.m. I was going to take my lunch breaks away from my desk. And most importantly, I was going to call Dad every Sunday morning and really listen to what he had to say. It was a small beginning, but it felt like the first authentic choice I'd made in years. The Sunday morning phone calls became the anchor of my week in ways I never could have anticipated. What started as duty calls to check on Dad's health gradually transformed into conversations I genuinely looked forward to, discussions that reminded me there was a world beyond quarterly reports and client presentations. Dad had this gift for asking questions that forced me to think beyond my immediate work stress. Instead of, "How was your week?" he'd ask things like, "What surprised you this week?" or, "Tell me about someone who made you smile." At first, these questions annoyed me because they required more thought than I was used to giving, but gradually, I found myself paying attention to my days differently, collecting small moments and observations to share with him. 3 weeks after that first real conversation, Dad invited me to volunteer with him at the community center. "Just for one Saturday morning," he said. "I want you to meet some of the kids I've been telling you about, and honestly, I could use an extra pair of hands. We've got more broken bikes than I can handle alone." I almost said no automatically. Saturdays were usually my catch-up days for work projects that had fallen behind during the week. But something about the way he asked, not demanding or guilt-tripping, but genuinely inviting me into something he cared about, made me agree. The Pilsen Community Center on Saturday mornings was controlled chaos in the best possible way. Kids ranging from about 8 to 15 were scattered throughout the building, some working on homework in the main room, others playing pickup basketball in the gym, and a dedicated group clustered around Dad's bike repair station in the back corner. "Everybody," Dad announced as we walked in, "this is my daughter Jessica. She's going to help us today, so be nice to her and maybe she'll come back." A boy named Carlos, maybe 13 years old, looked up from the bike he was working on. "Mr. Miguel, does she know how to fix chains? Mine keeps falling off no matter what I do." I started to explain that I didn't know anything about bicycle repair, but Dad interrupted. "Jessica's got good hands and a smart brain. Carlos, why don't you show her what's happening with your chain, and you two can figure it out together." For the next 4 hours, I found myself completely absorbed in problems I'd never encountered before. How do you adjust a derailleur when the gears keep slipping? Why does this brake cable keep fraying? What's the best way to patch a tire that's been punctured multiple times? But more than the mechanical challenges, I was fascinated by the kids themselves. They approached these broken bikes with a combination of frustration and determination that reminded me of myself at their age, back when problems felt solvable rather than just manageable. When Carlos and I finally got his chain to stay in place, his grin of pure triumph was more satisfying than any client approval I'd received at Pinnacle. "Miss Jessica," a girl named Maria asked as we were cleaning up, "do you work with bikes for your job?" "No," I said, "I work with computers and presentations and things like that." "That sounds boring," she said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "This is way more fun." She wasn't wrong. Spending the morning solving tangible problems with immediate results felt incredibly refreshing after weeks of abstract campaigns and theoretical outcomes. When you fixed a bike, it either worked or it didn't. There was no ambiguity, no endless revisions, no moving target of client expectations. On the drive home, Dad was quieter than usual. Finally, he said, "You were really good with those kids. They're great kids. I can see why you love working with them." "It's not just that," he said. "You were present in a way I haven't seen you be in years. You weren't checking your phone every 5 minutes or thinking about what you had to do next. You were just there." He was right. For 4 hours, I hadn't thought about work once. I hadn't felt the low-level anxiety that usually accompanied my weekends, the constant awareness of Monday morning deadlines approaching. I'd been completely engaged in the moment, focused on helping Carlos with his chain and listening to Maria's stories about riding her bike to school. "Papa," I said, "can I come back next Saturday?" His smile was answer enough. Over the following weeks, Saturday mornings at the community center became non-negotiable for me. I started bringing donuts for the kids and coffee for the other volunteers. I learned the names of all the regular kids and began to understand their personalities and challenges. Carlos was mechanically gifted but struggled with reading, so I started helping him with homework after we finished working on bikes. Maria was incredibly artistic and began decorating the bikes we repaired with colorful ribbons and stickers. Dad introduced me to the other volunteers, mostly retired men and women who'd found purpose in giving back to their community. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, who taught cooking classes in the center's kitchen, and Mr. Thompson, who ran a chess club for the older kids. These were people who'd worked ordinary jobs their whole lives but had discovered in retirement that their real value lay in mentoring and nurturing the next generation. "You know what I like about this place?" Dad said one Saturday as we were loading fixed bikes into his truck to deliver them back to the kids' families. "Nobody here cares about performance metrics or quarterly goals. We just care about whether these kids have reliable transportation and whether they're learning something useful." I was beginning to understand what he meant. At Pinnacle, success was measured in abstract numbers, click-through rates, conversion percentages, revenue growth. But at the community center, success was immediate and visible. A kid whose bike had been broken for months could suddenly ride to school again. A child who'd never held a wrench before could adjust their own brakes. The contrast between these two worlds was becoming more stark every week. Monday through Friday, I worked in a gleaming office tower managing campaigns for wealthy clients who already had everything they needed. Saturday mornings, I worked in a rundown community center helping kids whose families couldn't afford to fix basic necessities when they broke. "Mija," Dad said one Sunday during our weekly call, "you sound different lately. More like yourself." "What do you mean?" "More like the Jessica I raised. Curious, engaged, caring about things that matter. Less like the robot who answers work emails during dinner." He wasn't wrong. The Saturday mornings at the community center were changing something fundamental in how I approached the rest of my life. I was sleeping better, eating actual meals. Instead of grabbing whatever was convenient, and most surprisingly, I was performing better at work because I was less stressed and more focused during office hours. But the biggest change was in my relationship with Dad himself. Our Sunday conversations had evolved from obligatory check-ins to genuine exchanges about life, values, and what we were learning from our respective weeks. He told me stories about his childhood in Mexico that I'd never heard before, about the uncle who taught him to fix engines and the grandmother who insisted that honest work was its own reward regardless of how much it paid. I told him about my college years, about the dreams I'd had before I got caught up in the corporate ladder, about the creative projects I'd abandoned when they stopped seeming practical. We talked about Mom, sharing memories I'd been too busy to revisit and processing grief I'd been too focused on work to fully experience. "You know what your mother would say if she could see you now?" Dad asked one Sunday. "What?" She'd say. "You're finally growing into the woman she always knew you could be. Not the successful professional woman, though she'd be proud of that too. The complete woman, the one who uses her talents to lift other people up." Those words stayed with me through the week, especially during moments when work stress threatened to overwhelm me again. I started seeing my job differently, not as the center of my identity but as one component of a life that included family, community service, and personal relationships. The Saturday before everything changed, Dad and I were working together on a particularly challenging bike repair. The frame was bent, the wheels were out of alignment, and the chain was so rusty it barely moved. Most people would have declared it beyond saving and thrown it away. "Papa," I said, "this bike is pretty much destroyed. Maybe we should just start over with a different one." He looked at me with a gentle smile. "Mija, this bike belongs to a little boy named David whose family can't afford to replace it. His mother works 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. This isn't just a bike to him, it's his independence, his way of getting to school and helping his family. We don't give up on things just because they're difficult to fix." We spent 3 hours on that bike, taking it completely apart and rebuilding it piece by piece. When we finally got it working again, it looked almost new despite being at least 10 years old. The satisfaction of seeing it transform from broken to functional was unlike anything I'd experienced in my professional life. "See?" Dad said as we tested the gears one final time. "Almost everything can be saved if you're willing to put in the work and you don't give up too quickly." I didn't realize at the time that he was talking about more than just bicycles. The first sign that my newfound balance was about to be threatened came on a Monday morning in late October when Amanda Walsh called an emergency team meeting. I'd Been at Pinnacle for almost 6 years by then, and I knew the difference between Amanda's usual dramatic crisis calls and something genuinely serious. This felt different, more urgent and focused than her typical performance theater. Amanda had been promoted to marketing director 8 months earlier, and she was still desperately trying to prove herself worthy of the position. She was smart and hardworking, but she had this insecurity that manifested as micromanagement and artificial urgency about everything. Where her predecessor had been collaborative and trusting, Amanda was controlling and suspicious, always convinced that disaster was lurking just around the corner. "Team," she announced as we gathered in the conference room, "I need everyone's full attention because what I'm about to tell you could make or break all of our careers here." I glanced around the table at my colleagues, Sarah Kim, who handled our social media campaigns, Marcus Johnson, our data analytics specialist, and Tom Bradley, our senior graphic designer. We all had the same expression of weary anticipation. Amanda's career-making announcements had become so frequent that they'd lost their impact. The Morrison Group has indicated that they're considering consolidating their marketing spend with a single agency, Amanda continued, her voice tight with stress. They're currently working with 4 different firms, and they want to streamline everything under one comprehensive partner. The good news is that we're being considered for the primary contract. The bad news is that we're competing against 3 much larger agencies with significantly more resources. This was genuinely big news. The Morrison Group was our largest client, accounting for nearly 30% of our department's annual revenue. Losing them would mean layoffs, budget cuts, and possibly the elimination of our entire marketing division. "The presentation is scheduled for December 15th, Amanda said, "which gives us exactly 7 weeks to create the most comprehensive campaign proposal we've ever developed. This isn't just about keeping a client, this is about proving that Pinnacle's marketing department deserves to exist." Over the next hour, Amanda outlined an ambitious timeline that would require all of us to essentially double our normal workload. We needed market research, competitive analysis, creative campaigns, budget projections, and implementation timelines for a year-long marketing strategy. It was the kind of project that a larger agency would assign to a team of 20 people. And we were expected to complete it with 5. "I need complete commitment from everyone," Amanda said, looking directly at me. "No distractions, no outside obligations, no excuses. For the next 7 weeks, this project is your only priority." After the meeting, Sarah pulled me aside in the hallway. "Jessica, this is insane, right? She's basically asking us to work nonstop until mid-December." She was right, but I also understood the stakes. Losing the Morrison account wouldn't just mean layoffs for our department, it would mean the end of the career I'd spent 6 years building. Despite my growing appreciation for life outside work, I wasn't ready to give up everything I'd achieved at Pinnacle. "It's a lot," I agreed, "but if we pull this off, we'll probably all get promoted. And if we don't, we might not have jobs to complain about." That afternoon, Amanda sent out a detailed project timeline with individual assignments and deadlines. My responsibility was to coordinate all the components and create the final presentation materials, which meant I was essentially dependent on everyone else completing their work before I could do mine. It was a setup that guaranteed I'd be working until the last possible minute. The first few weeks weren't too bad. I managed to maintain my Saturday mornings at the community center by getting up earlier and staying later during the week. Dad noticed that I was more stressed during our Sunday calls, but I assured him it was temporary, just a particularly demanding project that would be over by Christmas. But as November progressed, Amanda's demands became increasingly unreasonable. She started scheduling emergency meetings that lasted for hours but accomplished nothing substantive. She would review our work and demand major revisions based on her latest anxieties about what the Morrison Group might want. Most frustrating of all, she began treating every minor setback as a potential catastrophe that required immediate crisis management. "Jessica," she said during one particularly tense meeting, "I need you to understand that your performance on this project is being watched very closely by senior management. This is your opportunity to show that your leadership material, but it's also your chance to prove that you can prioritize when it really matters." There was something in the way she said, "prioritize," that felt like a warning. Amanda had noticed my improved work-life balance over the past few months, and she didn't approve. She was the kind of manager who equated long hours with loyalty and personal sacrifice with professional commitment. "Amanda," I said carefully, "I've never missed a deadline or failed to deliver what was promised. My work quality hasn't suffered." "It's not about quality," she replied. "It's about dedication. The Morrison Group expects to work with people who are completely invested in their success. They don't want to hear about weekend plans or family obligations when there's work to be done." I left that meeting with a growing sense of unease. Amanda was clearly building a case for why my recent lifestyle changes were incompatible with the demands of the Morrison project. She was positioning herself to blame any potential failure on my supposedly divided attention. 2 weeks later, the pressure intensified dramatically. Marcus had fallen behind on his data analysis because Amanda kept changing the parameters of what she wanted measured. Sarah was struggling to develop creative concepts because Amanda rejected everything as either too conservative or too risky. Tom was redoing graphics for the third time because Amanda decided the color scheme was too playful for a financial services presentation. "This is impossible," Tom complained during one of our late-night work sessions. "She doesn't actually know what she wants, but she's convinced that whatever we produce isn't it." He was right, but pointing that out wouldn't change our situation. Amanda was operating from a place of fear, terrified that losing the Morrison account would destroy her newly established credibility as a director. Her anxiety was infecting the entire team, creating a feedback loop of stress and counterproductive perfectionism. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in mid-November when Amanda announced that we needed to completely scrap 2 weeks of work and start over with a fresh approach. According to her, the Morrison Group had given subtle feedback suggesting they wanted something more innovative and forward-thinking. "Amanda," Sarah said, "what exactly did they say?" "Because the feedback I heard was that they liked our strategic framework and wanted us to develop it further." "They said it was fine," Amanda snapped. "Fine isn't good enough when we're competing against the top agencies in Chicago. Fine gets us eliminated in the first round." That weekend, I missed my Saturday morning at the community center for the first time in months. I spent both days at the office, trying to salvage usable elements from our discarded work and beginning the overwhelming task of rebuilding our entire presentation from scratch. Dad called on Sunday evening while I was still at the office. "Mia, I missed you today." Carlos asked where you were, and I didn't know what to tell him. "I'm sorry, Papa. This project is just more demanding than I expected. I should be back to normal schedule after December 15th. Is everything okay? You sound exhausted." I wanted to tell him about Amanda's impossible demands and the growing fear that no matter how hard we worked, it wouldn't be enough. I wanted to explain that the job security I'd counted on was disappearing and that I felt trapped between my commitment to the kids at the community center and my need to protect my career. But Dad had spent 40 years in jobs where he had no control over unreasonable demands and arbitrary deadlines. He'd already given me all the wisdom he could about standing up for myself and not letting work consume my humanity. Complaining to him now would just be asking him to carry worry he couldn't do anything about. "I'm fine, Elite. Just tired. It'll be over soon." After I hung up, I sat alone in the empty office building, surrounded by half-finished presentations and the electronic hum of fluorescent lights. Through the windows, I could see the city lights stretching out in all directions, millions of people living their lives while I was trapped in this sterile box, sacrificing my weekends and my peace of mind for a client who might choose someone else anyway. For the first time in months, I felt that familiar weight of emptiness settling back into my chest. The person I'd been becoming through my relationships with Dad and the kids at the community center felt far away and fragile, like a dream I was already starting to forget. Amanda's shadow was growing longer, and I was beginning to realize that she saw my emerging life outside work not as a sign of health, but as a threat to be eliminated. The week before Thanksgiving was when everything finally clicked into place, both with the Morrison project and with my life outside work. It was one of those rare periods when all the different pieces of your existence seem to harmonize instead of competing with each other, when you catch a glimpse of what life could look like if you managed to balance everything perfectly. We'd been working on the Morrison presentation for 6 weeks, and despite Amanda's constant revisions and manufactured crises, we were actually producing something exceptional. The data Marcus had compiled told a compelling story about market opportunities the Morrison Group hadn't yet explored. Sarah's creative concepts were striking without being flashy, sophisticated enough for a financial services audience but memorable enough to stand out from our competitors. Tom's graphics were clean and professional, perfectly complementing the strategic narrative we were building. Even Amanda seemed to be relaxing slightly as we approached our final deadline. During our Monday morning team meeting, she actually smiled when reviewing our latest draft. "This is good work, everyone. Really good. I think we might actually have a winning presentation here." It was the first time in weeks that she'd expressed genuine confidence in our project rather than anxiety about potential problems. The relief in the room was almost tangible as we realized we might actually pull this off without killing ourselves in the process. "Jessica," Amanda said as the meeting was ending, "I want you to know that your coordination on this project has been excellent. The way you've managed to keep everyone on track while maintaining quality standards, it's exactly the kind of leadership we need more of in this department." I left that meeting feeling lighter than I had in months. After weeks of feeling like I was disappointing everyone in my life by not being fully present anywhere, it seemed like I might be able to satisfy both my professional obligations and my personal commitments. That afternoon, I was able to leave the office at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks. Instead of going straight home to my apartment, I drove to Pilsen to surprise Dad with an impromptu visit. I found him in his kitchen, preparing ingredients for the Thanksgiving dinner he was planning to cook for some of the volunteer coordinators from the community center. "Mija," he said, his face lighting up with surprise and pleasure. "What are you doing here? Don't you have that big project to work on?" "We're in good shape," I said, and realized it was the first time in weeks I'd been able to say that honestly. "I wanted to see what you were cooking and maybe steal some dinner if you have enough." For the next 3 hours, we worked together in his small kitchen, chopping vegetables and seasoning the turkey he'd been marinating since morning. Dad told me stories about the Thanksgiving traditions he remembered from his childhood in Mexico. And I found myself sharing memories of holidays when Mom was still alive, celebrations I'd been too busy to think about in recent years. "You know what I'm most grateful for this year?" Dad said as we sat down to eat our impromptu preview dinner. "What's that?" "Getting my daughter back. The real Jessica, not the work version who's always looking at her phone and thinking about her next meeting." He was right. Over the past few months, I'd been gradually returning to a version of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. The woman who laughed easily, who was genuinely curious about other people's lives, who found satisfaction in solving problems that weren't related to quarterly revenue targets. That Saturday, I returned to the community center for the first time in 2 weeks, and the welcome I received from the kids was overwhelming. Carlos had been saving a particularly challenging bike repair to work on together, and Maria had made me a card decorated with drawings of bicycles and flowers. Even the newer kids, ones I barely knew, seemed excited to have me back. "Miss Jessica," Sophia asked while we were adjusting the seat height on her bike, "are you going to keep coming here after your work project is finished?" "Of course," I said. "Why would you think I wouldn't?" "Mr. Miguel said you might have to stop volunteering if your job got too busy." I looked over at Dad, who was helping another child with a stubborn brake cable. He caught my eye and shrugged apologetically. I told them the truth, "Mija. That sometimes adults have to make difficult choices between the things they want to do and the things they have to do." Later, as we were cleaning up the repair station, I asked Dad about his conversation with the kids. "Papa, did you really think I might stop coming here?" "I was worried," he admitted. "The past few weeks, you've sounded more and more like the old Jessica, the one who was so focused on work that everything else became secondary. I've seen what happens when people let their jobs take over their entire lives. I didn't want that to happen to you again." His honesty was both touching and sobering. Dad had watched me disappear into corporate culture once before, and he was afraid of losing me again to the same forces that had made me a stranger to my own life. "That's not going to happen," I told him. "I've learned too much about what really matters to go back to that." "I hope so, Mija. But sometimes the choice isn't as clear as we think it's going to be." That Sunday, Dad and I had one of our best conversations ever. Instead of just catching up on the events of our respective weeks, we talked about deeper things, what we'd learned about ourselves in recent months, what we hoped the future would bring, what it meant to live a life aligned with your values, rather than just your ambitions. "You know what I've realized?" I told him. "All those years when I thought success meant working harder and earning more money, I was actually just running away from the fear of not being good enough. But watching you with those kids, seeing how much satisfaction you get from teaching them and helping them, it's made me understand that real success is about contribution, not accumulation." Dad nodded thoughtfully. "Your mother used to say that the best measure of a life well lived isn't what you accomplished for yourself, but what you made possible for other people." The Morrison presentation was scheduled for the following Thursday, and as that deadline approached, I felt genuinely confident about our chances. We'd created something I was proud of, work that represented the best of our collective talents and efforts. More importantly, I'd managed to maintain my commitments to both my career and my community throughout the process. Tuesday evening, Amanda called a final team meeting to rehearse our presentation one last time. Everything went smoothly. Our timing was perfect, our materials were polished, and our team dynamics felt collaborative rather than stressed. "I'm really proud of what we've accomplished here," Amanda said as we were packing up. "Regardless of what happens Thursday, this presentation represents the best work our department has ever produced." Wednesday night, I had dinner with Dad at his apartment. He'd made my favorite meal, carne asada with homemade tortillas, and we spent the evening talking about everything except work. He told me about a new volunteer project he was considering, helping to organize a community garden in one of the vacant lots near the center. I told him about a book I'd finally had time to read, the first novel I'd finished in over a year. Mija, he said as I was getting ready to leave, I want you to know how proud I am of the woman you've become. Not just because of your professional success, but because of the way you've figured out how to be successful without losing yourself. Papa, that's largely because of you. The conversations we've been having, the time at the community center. It's reminded me who I am underneath all the corporate stuff. No, he said, pulling me into one of his warm, enveloping hugs. You figured that out yourself. I just provided a safe place for you to remember. That night, I fell asleep feeling more content and balanced than I had in years. The Morrison presentation was ready, my relationship with Dad was stronger than it had been since before Mom died, and I had a community of kids and volunteers who genuinely valued my presence in their lives. For the first time since college, I felt like I was living as a complete person rather than just performing as a professional success story. I had work that challenged me, relationships that nourished me, and a sense of purpose that extended beyond my own advancement. I had no idea that in less than 24 hours, everything I'd spent months building would come crashing down in the most devastating way possible. The call came at 5:43 a.m. on Thursday morning, November 30th. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my alarm clock, wide awake with pre-presentation nerves, when my phone started vibrating on the nightstand. The Morrison presentation wasn't until 2 p.m., but I'd been lying there since 4 a.m. mentally rehearsing our talking points and visualizing potential client questions. When I saw Northwestern Memorial Hospital on the caller ID, my first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Hospitals didn't call people at dawn unless something terrible had happened, and nothing terrible was supposed to happen today. Today was supposed to be the culmination of 7 weeks of intensive work, the day that would either secure our department's future or end all our careers at Pinnacle. Is this Jessica Martinez? The voice was professional but gentle, the kind of tone healthcare workers use when they're about to deliver news that will change someone's life forever. Yes, this is Jessica. Ms. Martinez, this is Dr. Patricia Reyes from Northwestern Memorial. I'm calling about your father, Miguel Martinez. He was brought to our emergency department this morning. The world tilted sideways. What happened? Is he okay? Ms. Martinez, I'm very sorry to tell you that your father suffered a massive cardiac event sometime during the night. His neighbor found him unresponsive this morning and called 911. The paramedics brought him here, but despite our best efforts, we were unable to revive him. I'm so sorry for your loss. The words hit me like physical blows. Cardiac event. Unresponsive. Unable to revive. Loss. Each clinical term felt like it was coming from underwater, muffled and impossible to fully comprehend. I don't understand, I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to myself. I just saw him 2 days ago. He was fine. We had dinner together. He was talking about starting a community garden project. Sometimes these cardiac events happen very suddenly, especially in older adults, Dr. Reyes explained patiently. The preliminary examination suggests it was a massive heart attack. It would have been very quick, and he wouldn't have experienced any pain. I was sitting on the edge of my bed in my pajamas, trying to process information that felt completely impossible. Dad was 68 years old and in good health. He walked everywhere, ate vegetables from the local market, had more energy than most people half his age. He couldn't be dead. Dead was something that happened to other people's parents, people who were sick or fragile or unprepared. Ms. Martinez, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. What do I need to do? Where do I need to go? Dr. Reyes gave me practical information about coming to the hospital, about identifying the body, about next steps for arranging funeral services. I wrote everything down mechanically, my handwriting shaky but legible, because focusing on logistics was the only way to keep from falling completely apart. After I hung up, I sat in my bedroom for a long time, staring at the notepad where I'd written, Northwestern Memorial, 7th floor, ask for Dr. Reyes. The words looked like they were written in a foreign language, instructions for a life that belonged to someone else. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda, team meeting at 8 a.m. to do final prep for Morrison presentation. Don't be late. Morrison presentation. For a moment, I couldn't remember what that meant. The urgent project that had consumed my life for the past 7 weeks suddenly felt like something from a different universe, completely irrelevant to the reality that my father was dead and I was alone in the world. I called Amanda from my car. As I drove to the hospital, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. Amanda, I can't make the team meeting this morning. My father died during the night. I need to go to the hospital and make arrangements. There was a pause that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Jessica, I'm so sorry to hear that. This must be incredibly difficult for you. I waited for her to say that of course I should take whatever time I needed, that the team would handle the presentation without me, that family emergencies took priority over everything else. Instead, she said, I know this is terrible timing, but we really need you for the Morrison presentation this afternoon. This is the most important day in our department's history. Amanda, my father is dead. I need to identify his body and start planning. His funeral. Of course, absolutely. But couldn't you handle the initial arrangements this morning and then come in for the presentation? It's only a few hours, and we've all worked so hard to get to this point. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you seriously asking me to give a client presentation on the day my father died? I'm not asking you to pretend nothing happened, she said quickly. I'm just saying that your father would probably want you to honor your professional commitments. This presentation could determine your entire career trajectory. The manipulative logic of that statement made me physically sick. Amanda was using my grief and my father's death to guilt me into prioritizing work over my own emotional needs. I need bereavement leave, I said firmly. 3 days, starting today. It's company policy. Another pause. Jessica, you know I'm sympathetic to your situation, but we're in the middle of the most critical project our department has ever undertaken. The Morrison Group specifically requested that you be part of the presentation team. Backing out now would be extremely unprofessional. Backing out? My father died 6 hours ago. I understand that, and I'm not minimizing your loss. But we have responsibilities to our client and our colleagues. Everyone on this team has made sacrifices to get us to this point. I was sitting in the hospital parking garage by then, surrounded by concrete walls and fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unreal. Through my windshield, I could see people walking to and from the hospital entrance, some of them crying, others looking relieved, all of them dealing with the most important moments of their lives while I was having an argument about work obligations. Amanda, I'm taking bereavement leave whether you approve it or not. It's my legal right. Fine, she said, her voice turning cold and professional. But I want you to understand that the Morrison Group will be told that a key member of our presentation team was unavailable due to personal issues. That's going to reflect poorly on our department's reliability and professionalism. Then tell them the truth. Tell them my father died and I needed to bury him. Jessica, I really hope you'll reconsider this decision. Your career at Pinnacle depends on how you handle situations like this. We remember who shows up when it matters most. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me alone in that parking garage with the echo of her threat ringing in my ears. I sat there for 10 minutes, crying harder than I had since my mother's death 8 years earlier, overwhelmed by grief and fury and the crushing realization that my job, which I'd thought provided security and purpose, was actually a trap that valued my productivity more than my humanity. Inside the hospital, everything moved with surreal efficiency. Dr. Reyes was kind and patient, explaining the medical details in terms I could understand and giving me time to ask questions I didn't know how to formulate. The administrative staff helped me understand the process for arranging body transport to a funeral home, for obtaining death certificates, for notifying Social Security and other agencies. But the moment that broke me completely was when they asked if I wanted to see Dad's body. I followed a nurse down a long, sterile hallway to a room that was kept unnaturally cold and quiet. Dad was lying on a metal table under a white sheet, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. His face was peaceful, almost like he was sleeping, but his skin had a waxy quality that made it clear he was no longer the man who'd hugged me goodbye 2 nights earlier. I stood next to the table and held his hand, which was cold and stiff in a way that made death feel suddenly, devastatingly real. Papa, I whispered, I'm so sorry. I should have spent more time with you. I should have called you yesterday. I should have told you more often how much I loved you. The nurse who'd accompanied me waited respectfully in the corner while I said goodbye to the most important person in my life. When I finally looked up, she handed me a plastic bag containing Dad's personal effects, his wallet, his reading glasses, his house keys, and the small notebook where he kept repair tips for the kids at the community center. I opened the notebook and found page after page of his careful handwriting. Sophia's bike needs new brake pads. Carlos is ready to learn gear adjustments. Maria wants to paint her bike frame purple. He'd been planning projects and tracking progress for kids who would never see him again, volunteer work he'd never be able to finish. That's when the full weight of my loss hit me. Dad wasn't just gone, his entire world of relationships and responsibilities had been erased. The kids at the community center would show up on Saturday expecting to work on their bikes with Mr. Miguel, but he wouldn't be there. The volunteer coordinators would wait for him to show up for their Thanksgiving dinner, but his chair would remain empty. I called the community center from the hospital parking lot to tell them what had happened. Mrs. Rodriguez answered the phone, and when I explained that Dad had died during the night, she started crying so hard she couldn't speak. Eventually, she passed the phone to Mr. Thompson, who told me in a shaky voice that they'd notify all the volunteers and kids, that they'd plan some kind of memorial service, that Dad had been loved by everyone who knew him. "Jessica," he said, "your father talked about you constantly. He was so proud of the woman you'd become, especially these past few months. He said you'd figured out how to be successful without losing your soul." Those words should have been comforting, but instead they made me feel like a fraud. Here I was, on the day of Dad's death, being threatened by my supervisor for choosing family over work obligations. How was that evidence of someone who hadn't lost her soul? I spent the rest of the morning at Gonzalez's funeral home, making arrangements I'd never imagined having to make. Choosing a casket, selecting flowers, writing an obituary that tried to capture the essence of a man who'd lived with quiet dignity and died with no warning. The funeral director was patient and professional, guiding me through decisions that felt impossibly significant and completely arbitrary at the same time. By noon, I was emotionally and physically exhausted. I'd been functioning on pure adrenaline and shock for 6 hours, handling logistics and making arrangements while the reality of Dad's death sat like a weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe normally. My phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and texts from work. Amanda had sent increasingly urgent messages about the Morrison presentation. Sarah and Marcus had texted condolences mixed with questions about whether they should proceed without me, and I had 17 missed calls from our office number. Finally, I turned my phone off and drove home to my apartment. I needed silence and space to process what had happened, to begin grieving properly instead of managing everyone else's anxiety about work obligations. But even in the privacy of my own space, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was failing everyone. I was failing Dad by not being able to protect him from a heart attack that came without warning. I was failing my colleagues by abandoning them on the most important day of our professional lives. I was failing myself by being too overwhelmed to think clearly about anything. The Morrison presentation was happening in 2 hours, and for the first time in my career, I genuinely didn't care whether we won or lost. The project that had consumed my life for 7 weeks felt completely meaningless in the face of losing the person who'd taught me what actually mattered. But Amanda's threats echoed in my head, reminding me that my grief was inconvenient, my priorities were unprofessional, and my career would suffer because I'd chosen to bury my father instead of impressing a client. The Morrison presentation went ahead without me that Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning, I knew my career at Pinnacle Financial Services was effectively over. Amanda hadn't waited even 24 hours before beginning her campaign to destroy my professional reputation and eliminate me from the company. I learned this when Sarah Kim called me Friday evening as I was sitting in Dad's apartment, surrounded by boxes of his belongings and trying to figure out how to organize a lifetime of memories. "Jessica, I probably shouldn't be telling you this," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger, "but you need to know what Amanda is saying about you." I'd been dreading this conversation. During the 18 months I'd worked directly under Amanda, I'd watched her systematically undermine colleagues who didn't meet her impossible standards of loyalty and availability. She had a talent for making professional destruction look like natural consequences rather than deliberate sabotage. What did she tell them? She told the Morrison Group that you had a family situation that prevented you from attending the presentation. But she said it in a way that made it sound like you'd chosen to skip work for something trivial. Then she spent 20 minutes apologizing for your absence and explaining how your lack of commitment had compromised the entire project. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Amanda had taken my father's death, the most devastating loss of my adult life, and weaponized it to justify my professional execution. "Did we win the account?" "That's the worst part," Sarah said. "Yes, we won. The Morrison Group loved our strategic framework and signed a 2-year contract worth $3 million. Amanda's presentation was flawless, and the clients were impressed with our comprehensive approach. So the emergency that had been used to justify threatening my job had been completely manufactured. The presentation that supposedly couldn't succeed without my participation had succeeded spectacularly without me. Amanda had proven that the crisis she'd created around my absence was entirely artificial, designed to punish me for prioritizing grief over corporate theater. "There's more," Sarah continued. "Amanda called an all-hands meeting this morning and announced that she's restructuring the department to improve our reliability and professional standards. She's eliminating your position and redistributing your responsibilities among the rest of us." "She's firing me?" "She's being more subtle than that. She's making the case that your role as project coordinator is redundant, that the team functions more efficiently when everyone reports directly to her. She's framing it as organizational optimization rather than retaliation for taking bereavement leave." The strategy was classic Amanda: create a business justification for personal revenge, eliminate the evidence of illegal retaliation by making it look like a rational management decision. If I tried to file a complaint, she could point to the successful Morrison presentation as proof that the department didn't actually need my position. Sarah, did anyone object? Did anyone point out that this is obviously retaliation for taking legally protected leave? There was a long pause. Jessica, everyone is scared for their own jobs. The Morrison contract saved our department, but Amanda made it clear that future success depends on complete loyalty and availability. Nobody wants to be the next person targeted for having divided priorities. I understood. My colleagues weren't cowards, they were employees with mortgages and families and career aspirations that depended on staying in Amanda's good graces. Standing up for me would have meant risking their own financial security for a principle that might not protect them anyway. But understanding their position didn't make the abandonment feel less painful. For 6 years, I'd been the reliable team member who covered for colleagues when they had emergencies, who stayed late to fix other people's mistakes, who took on extra responsibilities without complaint. Now, when I needed basic human decency in return, I was being treated like a liability to be eliminated. Monday morning, I received an email from Human Resources requesting a meeting to discuss my transition to new opportunities. The language was corporate euphemism at its finest, designed to make termination sound like career development. Robert Chen, the HR director, was a decent man trapped in an impossible position. He clearly understood that firing someone for taking bereavement leave was both illegal and morally reprehensible, but he was also under pressure from senior management to support Amanda's departmental restructuring. Jessica, I want to express my personal condolences for your father's passing, he said as we sat in his sterile office overlooking the Chicago River. I know this must be an incredibly difficult time for you. Thank you, I said. Can you explain why my position is being eliminated 3 days after I took legally protected bereavement leave? Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The department restructuring has been under consideration for several months. The timing is unfortunate, but it's not related to your recent absence. Robert, my father died Thursday morning. I took 3 days of bereavement leave, which is guaranteed by both company policy and Illinois state law. Now my job is being eliminated. If that's not retaliation, what would retaliation look like? I understand why this might appear connected, he said carefully, but Amanda has documented concerns about departmental efficiency that predate your recent leave. The Morrison presentation's success without your participation demonstrated that your coordination role might not be necessary. The logic was circular and infuriating. My absence during a family emergency was being used as evidence that my job wasn't important, even though my presence had been described as essential right up until the moment I needed to bury my father. So if I'd abandoned my father's funeral to give that presentation, would my position still exist? Robert looked genuinely pained. Jessica, I can't speculate about hypothetical scenarios. What I can tell you is that Pinnacle is prepared to offer you a generous severance package and excellent references for future employment opportunities. The severance offer was indeed generous: 6 months of salary continuation, extended health insurance benefits, and a letter of recommendation that praised my professionalism and work quality. It was designed to make legal action seem unnecessary and financially risky. If you're confident this restructuring is legitimate, I said, then you shouldn't mind if I have an employment attorney review the circumstances. Robert's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course you're free to consult with legal counsel. But I want you to understand that accepting this severance package requires signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and waiving your right to pursue legal action against the company. There it was, the ultimatum disguised as generosity. Take the money and sign away my right to hold them accountable, or forfeit the severance and face Amanda's well-documented talent for destroying careers through professional sabotage. I asked for time to consider the offer, but I already knew I couldn't accept it. Not because I was confident about winning a legal battle, but because signing that agreement would mean validating Amanda's message that employees who prioritized family over work deserved to be punished. That afternoon, I cleaned out my desk while my former colleagues avoided eye contact and made awkward small talk about weekend plans. 6 years of accumulated personal items fit into 2 cardboard boxes, a few framed photos, some favorite pens, a coffee mug Dad had given me for Christmas 3 years earlier. As I was packing up my computer files, Marcus approached my cubicle hesitantly. Jessica, I just want you to know that what's happening to you is wrong. We all know this is retaliation for taking bereavement leave. Then why isn't anyone willing to say that officially? He looked around the office nervously, then leaned closer and lowered his voice. Because Amanda made it clear that supporting you would be seen as disloyalty to the team. She told us that employees who can't prioritize during critical periods are a liability the department can't afford. And you believe that? I believe that Amanda has the power to destroy careers, and standing up to her won't bring your job back or bring your father back. Marcus was right, but his pragmatic cowardice felt like another betrayal on top of everything else I'd lost. I was learning that corporate loyalty was entirely one-directional. Employees were expected to sacrifice everything for their employers, but companies felt no obligation to protect employees who honored their basic human responsibilities. Walking out of the Pinnacle building for the last time, carrying my 2 boxes of personal belongings, I felt the full weight of how completely my life had unraveled in less than a week. I'd lost my father, my job, my professional reputation, and my faith in the company culture I'd spent 6 years trying to succeed within. The security guard who checked my boxes and collected my building access card was polite but detached, performing a routine he'd probably completed hundreds of times with other terminated employees. To him, I was just another person who hadn't worked out, another small drama in the endless cycle of corporate hiring and firing. But as I walked through those revolving glass doors for the last time, I wasn't thinking about my career or my financial future or Amanda's vindictive triumph. I was thinking about Dad's funeral, which was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and the fact that I'd have to bury him knowing that his death had been used as a weapon against me by people who'd never even met him. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal and spiritual. Amanda had taken the most sacred responsibility I'd ever had, caring for my father in death, and turned it into evidence of my inadequacy as an employee. She'd made my grief into a liability and my love into a weakness. Standing on the sidewalk outside Pinnacle Financial Services, holding everything that remained of my 6-year career, I finally understood what Dad had been trying to teach me about corporate culture and personal dignity. Some systems are designed to consume your humanity, and the only way to survive them is to refuse to be consumed. The funeral was held on a Tuesday morning at St. Pius Catholic Church in Pilsen, the same parish where Dad had been baptized as a child and where he'd married my mother 35 years earlier. I'd chosen Tuesday because it was the soonest the church was available, but also because I couldn't bear the thought of spending another weekend alone with my grief and the wreckage of my professional life. Walking into that church and seeing Dad's casket surrounded by flowers felt like stepping into someone else's nightmare. The man who'd been so vibrantly alive just 5 days earlier was reduced to a wooden box and a collection of sympathy arrangements that smelled overwhelmingly of lilies and roses. But what broke my heart more than anything was seeing how many people had come to honor Dad's memory. The church was nearly full, packed with volunteers from the community center, neighbors from his apartment building, mechanics from the shop where he'd worked for 40 years, and dozens of children whose bikes he'd repaired over the past 2 years. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Thompson had organized a group of volunteer coordinators who'd driven down from different neighborhoods across the city. Even the parish priest, Father Martinez, spoke about Dad with genuine affection rather than the generic platitudes I'd expected. Miguel Martinez lived his faith through service, Father Martinez said during his homily. He understood that love is not a feeling but an action, not a sentiment but a commitment to improving the lives of others. The children from the community center had made a banner that read, "Thank you Mr. Miguel," in colorful hand-painted letters. During the service, several of them stood up to share memories of working with Dad on their bikes, their young voices shaky with emotion as they described how patient and encouraging he'd been. Carlos, the boy whose chain Dad and I had fixed together months earlier, spoke about how Dad had taught him that broken things could be made useful again. Mr. Miguel said that bikes are like people, Carlos said, his 13-year-old voice carrying more wisdom than most adults ever achieve. Sometimes they get damaged and everyone thinks they're worthless, but if you're willing to work hard and be patient, you can make them better than they were before. I listened to these testimonials through a haze of grief and exhaustion, overwhelmed by the realization that while I'd been consumed with work stress and corporate politics, Dad had been quietly building a legacy of genuine human connection and service. After the burial service at Graceland Cemetery, people gathered at the community center for a memorial lunch that Mrs. Rodriguez and the other volunteers had organized. The same room where Dad had taught bike repair was now filled with folding tables covered in homemade food and photographs of Dad working with the children. I moved through the crowd mechanically, accepting condolences and thanking people for coming, but I felt disconnected from everything happening around me. My phone had been buzzing constantly with work-related calls and emails that I couldn't bring myself to answer or delete. Amanda had apparently decided that my termination needed to be handled with maximum efficiency. She'd scheduled meetings to redistribute my client accounts, reassigned my ongoing projects to other team members, and sent multiple requests for me to provide detailed transition documentation. The irony was devastating. The same woman who'd questioned my commitment to the team was now demanding that I work for free during my father's funeral to ensure smooth handovers of responsibilities she claimed were unnecessary. Jessica, Sarah Kim approached me during the memorial lunch, looking uncomfortable and guilty. "I'm really sorry to bother you today, but Amanda is insisting that I get the Morrison account files from you by tomorrow morning. She said the client has questions that only you can answer." I stared at Sarah, trying to process the fact that my colleague was asking me to work on my father's burial day to help the company that had just fired me for attending his funeral. "Sarah, they terminated my employment yesterday. I don't work for Pinnacle anymore." "I know, and I feel terrible about asking. But Amanda said that as a professional courtesy, you should provide transition assistance to avoid disrupting client relationships." "Professional courtesy," I repeated slowly. "She fired me for burying my father, and now she wants me to work for free to fix problems she created by firing me." Sarah looked miserable. "Jessica, I don't want to be here asking you this. But if I go back without those files, Amanda will make my life hell for the next 6 months." I understood Sarah's impossible position, but I couldn't enable Amanda's continued exploitation of my work and my grief. "Tell Amanda that if she needs information about the Morrison account, she can hire me as a consultant. My rate is $300 per hour, payable in advance." After Sarah left, I sat alone at one of the folding tables, surrounded by photographs of Dad and the lingering smell of Mexican food that reminded me of every family celebration we'd ever shared. The community center felt like the only place in the world where Dad's death was being treated as an actual loss rather than an inconvenience to be managed. Mrs. Rodriguez sat down beside me, her kind face lined with concern. "Mija, how are you holding up?" Really, not just the polite answer. For the first time since Thursday morning, I told someone the complete truth about what had happened with my job. Mrs. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, her expression growing more outraged as I described Amanda's threats and the termination that had followed my bereavement leave. "That's evil," she said flatly when I finished. "Not just illegal, evil. Your father would be furious if he knew they were treating his death like a business problem." "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "I've lost my father and my job in the same week. I can't afford to fight them in court, and even if I could, it wouldn't bring back my career or my reputation." "Mija, your father didn't raise you to give up when powerful people try to crush you. He raised you to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult." Mrs. Rodriguez was right, but fighting seemed impossible when I could barely function through basic daily tasks. That night, alone in my apartment, I tried to organize the practical details of my new reality. Without my Pinnacle salary, I had maybe 3 months of expenses saved before I'd need to start making serious cuts to my lifestyle. My health insurance would continue through the end of the month, then I'd need to find individual coverage that would probably cost twice as much and provide half the benefits. My professional network was contaminated by whatever story Amanda was telling about my termination, which meant finding new employment in Chicago's financial services industry would be extremely difficult. But the financial concerns felt almost manageable compared to the emotional devastation of losing Dad and discovering how disposable I'd been to the company I'd served loyally for 6 years. I kept thinking about all the times I'd stayed late to meet artificial deadlines, all the weekends I'd sacrificed for projects that turned out to be routine rather than urgent, all the family time I'd given up to prove my dedication to employers who viewed my grief as a scheduling inconvenience. Wednesday morning, I woke up on Dad's couch in his apartment, surrounded by boxes of his belongings and the remains of the sympathy flowers that were already starting to wilt. I'd been avoiding my own apartment because the silence there felt too complete, too reminiscent of the isolation I'd felt before rebuilding my relationship with Dad. My phone showed 47 missed calls and 83 unread emails, most of them work-related demands that felt increasingly surreal. Amanda had sent a formal letter threatening legal action if I didn't provide transition documentation within 48 hours. Several clients were calling directly, confused about why their primary contact had disappeared without explanation. The Morrison Group had left 3 voicemails expressing concern about continuity of service and requesting immediate meetings to review account status. The irony was perfect. The client whose presentation had been used to justify my termination was now demanding access to the expertise Amanda had claimed was unnecessary. I turned my phone off and spent the day sorting through Dad's personal papers, trying to organize his affairs while avoiding my own professional responsibilities. His filing system was meticulous, with folders for insurance policies, medical records, tax returns, and volunteer schedules organized by year and category. In the back of his desk drawer, I found a manila envelope marked, "For Jessica, important documents." Inside were copies of his will, bank account information, and a handwritten letter addressed to me. Mija, the letter began in Dad's careful script. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you're dealing with all the practical things that come after death. First, I want you to know that these past 2 years, watching you remember who you are underneath all that corporate stress, have been the happiest of my retirement. The letter continued for 3 pages, sharing memories I'd forgotten and expressing pride in my personal growth that I'd never realized he'd noticed. But the final paragraph stopped me cold. Jessica, I know your job is important to you, but I need you to promise me something. If they ever try to make you choose between your work and your family, between their priorities and your values, between their approval and your integrity, I want you to choose yourself. No company deserves your soul, and no career is worth sacrificing your humanity. You are worth more than any job can ever give you. I read that letter 5 times, crying harder with each reading, overwhelmed by the realization that Dad had somehow anticipated exactly the situation I was now facing. Even in death, he was still trying to teach me lessons about self-respect and personal dignity that I was too devastated to fully understand. That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez called to check on me. Mija, have you eaten anything today? You need to take care of yourself. I'm not hungry, I said, which was true. Food felt completely irrelevant when my entire life had collapsed in less than a week. Your father would be very upset if he knew you weren't eating. He'd probably march over there and make you a sandwich himself. The image of Dad fussing over my lack of appetite made me smile for the first time since his death. He would, wouldn't he? Yes, and then he'd sit you down and remind you that feeling sorry for yourself won't solve anything. Miguel Martinez didn't raise a daughter who gives up when life gets difficult. But giving up felt like the only rational response to circumstances that were completely beyond my control. I'd followed all the rules, met all the expectations, sacrificed personal relationships for professional success, and still ended up unemployed and alone with no clear path forward. The American dream I'd been chasing for 6 years had revealed itself to be a sophisticated trap designed to extract maximum value from employees while providing minimum security in return. I'd been loyal to a company that viewed my humanity as a liability and my grief as an inconvenience. Sitting in Dad's apartment that night, surrounded by the remnants of his life and the wreckage of my career, I felt smaller and more powerless than at any point since childhood. The woman who'd been confident enough to coordinate million-dollar campaigns and manage complex client relationships had been reduced to someone who couldn't even imagine what tomorrow might look like, let alone next month or next year. I was learning that rock bottom isn't a place you fall to, it's a place you choose to stop falling. And I hadn't chosen to stop yet. 2 weeks after Dad's funeral, I was sitting in his apartment going through the last box of his personal papers when I found something that changed everything. I'd been putting off this final box because it contained items from his work years at Rodriguez Auto Repair, and I wasn't emotionally ready to face reminders of the life he'd built before retirement. The box was filled with union newsletters, safety training certificates, and employee recognition awards that spanned nearly 4 decades of dedicated service. But at the bottom, wrapped in an old shop rag, was a leather portfolio I'd never seen before. Inside were documents that made my hands shake as I read them. Dad had kept every piece of labor rights documentation he'd ever received. There were pamphlets about workplace safety regulations, guides to understanding employee benefits, and detailed explanations of legal protections for workers facing discrimination or retaliation. But what stopped me cold was a manila folder, labeled, "For Jessica, Know Your Rights." Inside that folder was a business card for Elena Rodriguez, an employment law attorney who specialized in workers' rights violations. Attached to the card was a handwritten note from Dad. Elena helped my friend Carlos when his supervisor tried to fire him for taking sick leave to care for his diabetic daughter. She fights for working people who can't fight for themselves. Underneath the business card were photocopied pages from Illinois employment law statutes, with sections about bereavement leave highlighted in yellow marker. Dad had carefully marked the passages that established bereavement leave as protected time off, along with the penalties companies faced for retaliating against employees who used legally guaranteed benefits. But the document that made my heart race was a printed email exchange between Dad and Elena Rodriguez, dated just 3 months before his death. Dad had contacted her asking hypothetical questions about employment law protections for professional workers, specifically about scenarios where companies might pressure employees to prioritize work over family emergencies. Dear Ms. Rodriguez, Dad's email began, "My daughter works in corporate finance, and I'm concerned about the pressure her employer puts on employees to be available during personal crises. If a company threatened someone's job for taking legally protected leave, what would their options be?" Elena's response was detailed and encouraging. "Mr. Martinez, Illinois has strong protections for employees who need bereavement or family Emergency leave. Retaliation for using these protections is illegal and can result in significant compensation for affected employees. If your daughter ever faces this situation, she should document everything and contact my office immediately. I stared at that email exchange, reading it over and over, trying to process the fact that Dad had somehow anticipated exactly the situation I was now facing. He'd researched my legal rights months before I needed them, quietly preparing resources. I might need to protect myself from the kind of corporate exploitation he'd fought against his entire working life. At the bottom of the folder was a letter in Dad's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Mija, if you're reading this, it probably means something has gone wrong at your job and you're feeling powerless to fight back. I've spent 40 years watching companies treat workers like disposable resources, and I've learned that the only thing that stops them is when employees know their rights and have the courage to use them. You are not powerless. You have legal protections, and there are people who will help you enforce them. Don't let them convince you that accepting their mistreatment is professional or mature. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is hold employers accountable for their illegal behavior. I've included Elena's contact information because she understands that workers deserve dignity and respect regardless of how much money they make or how fancy their job titles are. If someone at your company tries to punish you for being human, for having family responsibilities or personal needs, I want you to fight back. Your mother and I didn't sacrifice so you could get a good education just so you could let corporations abuse you. We raised you to be strong enough to demand better. Use that strength, Mija. Make them pay for underestimating you. I called Elena Rodriguez that same afternoon, my voice shaking as I explained who I was and why I was calling. Ms. Rodriguez, my father was Miguel Martinez. He contacted you a few months ago asking about employment law protections. He passed away 2 weeks ago, and I think I need your help. Elena's voice was warm but immediately professional. Jessica, I remember your father. I'm so sorry for your loss. Miguel was clearly very proud of you and very concerned about protecting your rights as an employee. Tell me what happened. For the next hour, I told Elena everything: Dad's death, Amanda's threats, the impossible choice between attending his funeral and keeping my job, and the termination that followed my decision to take legally protected bereavement leave. Elena listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting specific details about dates and conversations. When I finished, Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Jessica, what happened? To you is textbook retaliation for using protected leave. It's illegal under both Illinois state law and federal employment regulations. Your employer violated multiple statutes, and you have grounds for a significant legal action. But they're claiming my position was eliminated for legitimate business reasons, I said. They're saying the department restructuring was planned in advance. That's a common defense strategy, Elena explained, but it rarely holds up under scrutiny. The timing of your termination, combined with your supervisor's documented threats about career consequences for taking bereavement leave, creates a clear pattern of retaliation. Illinois law doesn't require employers to wait a certain period. After protected leave to fire someone, any adverse employment action taken in connection with protected leave is presumptively retaliatory. Elena asked me to gather all the documentation I could find: emails from Amanda, text messages about the Morrison presentation, witness statements from colleagues who'd heard her threats, and any written materials about the supposed department restructuring. The key, Elena said, is that your supervisor explicitly told you that taking bereavement leave would be viewed as a lack of commitment and would affect your career trajectory. That's direct evidence of illegal retaliation, regardless of whatever business justification they manufacture after the fact. Over the next few days, I compiled a comprehensive file of evidence that painted a devastating picture of Amanda's systematic campaign against me. I had email threads where she questioned my dedication for asking about bereavement leave policies. I had text messages where she threatened that my absence would be noted by senior management. I had the recording of our phone call where she explicitly said my career at Pinnacle depended on how I handled the conflict between work and my father's funeral. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source, Marcus Johnson, my former colleague who'd been too afraid to support me publicly. He contacted me 3 days after my meeting with Elena, asking if we could meet for coffee. Jessica, he said, looking nervous and guilty, I need to tell you something about what's been happening at work since you left. Marcus explained that Amanda had been bragging about how she'd handled the Jessica situation to other department heads. According to him, she described my termination as a successful example of eliminating employees who couldn't prioritize during critical periods. She said you were a cautionary tale, Marcus continued, proof that the company needed people who understood that work always comes first. She told the senior partners that your absence during the Morrison presentation demonstrated why the company couldn't accommodate employees with divided loyalties. Even more damaging, Marcus revealed that Amanda had lied about the department restructuring being planned in advance. She started talking about eliminating your position the day after your father died, he said. Before that, there was never any discussion of restructuring or redundancies. She invented the business justification after she decided to fire you for taking bereavement leave. Marcus agreed to provide a written statement documenting Amanda's comments and the timeline of events. He also revealed that Sarah Kim and Tom Bradley were willing to testify about Amanda's threats regarding my career if I chose to prioritize family obligations over work demands. Why are you all willing to help now when you wouldn't support me when it mattered? I asked. Marcus looked ashamed. Because Amanda's behavior has gotten worse since she got away with firing you. She's using your termination as leverage against the rest of us, threatening that anyone who doesn't meet her availability expectations will face the same consequences. We realize that letting her destroy you made all of our jobs less secure. Elena was thrilled when I brought her Marcus's statement and the additional witness testimonies. Jessica, this case just went from strong to overwhelming. We have direct evidence of premeditation, witness testimony about retaliation, and documentation of your supervisor using your termination to threaten other employees. This is a labor attorney's dream case. But Elena also warned me about what lay ahead. Pinnacle will fight this aggressively. They'll hire expensive lawyers who'll try to discredit you personally and professionally. They'll claim you were a problem employee who was terminated for legitimate performance issues. They'll make you prove your worth rather than defending their illegal behavior. Can we win with this evidence? Absolutely. But winning isn't just about getting your job back or receiving financial compensation. It's about sending a message that companies can't punish employees for being human, for having families and personal responsibilities that sometimes conflict with corporate demands. That night, I called Mrs. Rodriguez to tell her about Elena and the legal case we were preparing. Mija, she said, your father would be so proud. He always said that the only thing that stops bullies is when someone finally stands up to them. I'm scared, I admitted. What if we lose? What if fighting them just makes everything worse? What if you win? She countered. What if your courage prevents them from doing this to someone else? What if standing up for yourself teaches other employees that they don't have to accept this kind of treatment? As I hung up the phone, I realized that Dad's final gift wasn't just the legal resources he'd prepared for me. It was the lesson that my dignity wasn't negotiable, that my worth as a person couldn't be determined by corporate performance metrics. And that sometimes the most important battle you can fight is the one that protects other people from the injustice you've experienced. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt something other than grief and despair. I felt angry, purposeful, and ready to make Amanda regret underestimating the daughter of a union mechanic who'd spent 40 years fighting for workers' rights. Elena Rodriguez operated out of a modest office in a converted brownstone on North Halsted, the kind of place that served working-class clients rather than corporate executives. Her waiting room was filled with union newsletters and informational pamphlets about workers' rights, and the walls were covered with thank you letters from employees who'd successfully fought workplace discrimination and retaliation. When Elena called me in for our first formal strategy meeting, I was struck by how different she felt from the corporate lawyers I'd encountered during my years at Pinnacle. She was in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct manner that came from years of representing people who couldn't afford to waste time on legal theater. Jessica, she said, spreading my employment file across her desk, I've reviewed all the documentation you provided, and I want to be completely honest about what we're facing. Pinnacle Financial Services is a well-connected company with expensive legal representation. They're going to throw everything they have at discrediting you and justifying their actions. Elena explained that corporate retaliation cases often came down to credibility battles between individual employees and institutional power structures designed to protect company interests. They'll argue that you were a marginal performer who was terminated for legitimate business reasons. They'll claim that your supervisor's comments were taken out of context or misunderstood. They'll try to make this about your professional inadequacies rather than their illegal behavior. But we have documentation, I said. We have witness statements and recorded conversations. Yes, and that evidence is strong. But Pinnacle will have their own documentation, performance reviews that suddenly become critical, productivity metrics that conveniently support their narrative, and testimony from managers who'll swear that your termination was part of a carefully planned restructuring. Elena's strategy was to build an overwhelming case that made denial impossible. We needed to document not just the immediate retaliation for my bereavement leave, but the broader pattern of illegal behavior that made my termination part of a systematic campaign against employee rights. The first step was gathering additional witness testimony from current and former Pinnacle employees who'd experienced similar treatment. Elena had learned from Marcus's statement that Amanda had been using my termination to threaten other employees, which suggested a pattern of retaliatory behavior that could support broader legal action. I want you to think about anyone who might have faced similar pressures, Elena said. Employees who were criticized for taking sick leave, who were passed over for promotions after requesting family accommodations, who were made to feel that their personal lives were incompatible with their professional responsibilities. Over the next week, I reached out to former colleagues and previous employees whose careers had been damaged by Amanda's management style. What I discovered was a troubling pattern of systematic abuse targeting anyone who prioritized family obligations over absolute corporate availability. Maria Santos, who'd worked in our department 2 years earlier, agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park. She'd been forced out of Pinnacle after requesting flexible scheduling to care for her elderly mother who had Alzheimer's disease. Amanda made my life hell, Maria told me, stirring her coffee with shaking hands. She kept saying that employees with complicated personal situations weren't suitable for client-facing roles. She started excluding me from important meetings, then claimed I wasn't engaged enough with key projects. Maria's experience followed the same pattern as mine: manufactured crises that conflicted with family responsibilities, artificial performance problems that justified professional punishment, and eventual termination disguised as departmental restructuring. Did you consider legal action? I asked. I couldn't afford to fight them, Maria said. I needed to find another job immediately to keep my mother in her care facility. Amanda knew I was financially vulnerable, and she used that against me. Carlos Mendez, a former data analyst who'd been terminated after his son was diagnosed with leukemia, met me for lunch in Chinatown. His story was even more devastating than Maria's. I was taking my kid to chemotherapy appointments twice a week, Carlos explained. Amanda kept scheduling mandatory meetings during those times, then acting like I was being unreasonable when I asked to reschedule. She told me that employees with divided attention couldn't handle the demands of our client base. Carlos had been fired after Amanda claimed his productivity had declined due to his inability to prioritize work responsibilities. Like Maria, he'd been too overwhelmed by his family's medical crisis to pursue legal action against Pinnacle. The worst part, Carlos said, was that she made me feel like a bad father and a bad employee. Like wanting to be with my son during cancer treatment made me unfit for professional responsibility. Elena was fascinated by these additional stories because they established a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior targeting employees with family responsibilities. This isn't just about your individual case anymore, she told me. We're looking at systematic violations of family leave protections and disability accommodations that could affect hundreds of employees. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Dr. Patricia Reyes, the physician who'd called to tell me about Dad's death. When Elena learned that Amanda had pressured me to prioritize work over my father's medical emergency, she suggested we document the medical circumstances to demonstrate how unreasonable Amanda's demands had been. Dr. Reyes agreed to provide a written statement about Dad's condition and the timeline of his death. Her letter was clinically precise and emotionally devastating. Mr. Miguel Martinez suffered a massive myocardial infarction that resulted in immediate cardiac arrest. The medical event occurred during the night of November 29, and he was discovered by a neighbor approximately 6 hours later. Mr. Martinez was pronounced dead upon arrival at Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 5:30 a.m. on November 30. Based on the medical evidence, Mr. Martinez's death was sudden and unexpected. His daughter Jessica Martinez was notified immediately upon confirmation of death, as she was his only surviving family member and designated emergency contact. The timing of Mr. Martinez's death created an urgent need for immediate family coordination of funeral arrangements, legal documentation, and personal affairs. Any employer who expected Ms. Martinez to prioritize work obligations over managing her father's death and funeral arrangements would be demonstrating a fundamental disregard for basic human decency and family responsibilities. Elena also suggested we document the broader impact of Amanda's management style on workplace culture and employee retention. She helped me contact the Illinois Department of Labor to request information about previous complaints filed against Pinnacle Financial Services. What we discovered was alarming. Over the past 3 years, Pinnacle had faced 17 formal complaints related to family leave violations, workplace discrimination, and retaliatory terminations. Most of these complaints had been settled quietly with confidential agreements that prevented public disclosure of the company's pattern of illegal behavior. "This is exactly what we need," Elena said, reviewing the complaint summaries. "It shows that your experience wasn't an isolated incident or a personality conflict with one supervisor. It's evidence of systemic corporate culture that violates employee rights on a regular basis." Elena also connected me with David Kim, a former Pinnacle senior manager who'd been forced out after reporting Amanda's discriminatory behavior to Human Resources. David had tried to advocate internally for employees facing family crises, and his efforts had been rewarded with professional sabotage and eventual termination. "Amanda operates with complete impunity," David told us during a video conference from his new job in Seattle. "Senior management knows about her retaliatory behavior, but they protect her because she generates revenue and maintains client relationships. They'd rather pay settlement money than address the underlying problems." David's insider perspective was invaluable because he could testify about senior management's knowledge of Amanda's illegal behavior and their deliberate decision to enable it rather than enforce legal compliance. But perhaps the most important ally Elena found for our case was Jennifer Walsh, a senior partner at Rodriguez, Martinez and Associates, a labor law firm that specialized in class action employment cases. Jennifer reviewed our evidence and immediately recognized the potential for broader legal action. "What you've documented," Jennifer told Elena, "isn't just individual retaliation. It's a pattern of systematic discrimination against employees with family responsibilities that could support a class action lawsuit affecting dozens of current and former Pinnacle employees." Jennifer proposed that we file both an individual retaliation claim and a broader class action suit challenging Pinnacle's corporate culture of family leave discrimination. The class action approach would give us more resources to fight Pinnacle's expensive legal team while providing justice for other employees who'd been too intimidated or financially vulnerable to pursue individual claims. "Companies like Pinnacle count on employees being too scared or too poor to fight back," Jennifer explained. "They use their economic power and legal resources to intimidate people into accepting illegal treatment. But when employees work together, when we can document systematic violations affecting multiple people, that changes the balance of power completely." As our legal team expanded and our evidence grew stronger, I began to understand that Dad's death had revealed something much larger than my individual mistreatment. We were uncovering a corporate culture that systematically punished employees for having human needs and family responsibilities, a system designed to extract maximum productivity while providing minimum protections for workers' basic dignity. The daughter of a union mechanic was about to take on one of Chicago's most prestigious financial services companies, and for the first time since Dad's death, I felt like the fight was worth having. The meeting with Pinnacle's legal team was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February, almost 3 months after Dad's death. Elena and Jennifer had spent weeks preparing our case, assembling witness statements, medical documentation, and evidence of systematic discrimination that painted a devastating picture of corporate misconduct. Pinnacle's response had been exactly what Elena predicted: an army of expensive lawyers from Morrison, Bradley & Klein, one of Chicago's most prestigious corporate law firms. They'd spent the intervening months conducting their own investigation, interviewing current employees, and preparing what they clearly expected to be an overwhelming defense. The meeting was held at Morrison, Bradley & Klein's downtown offices, a gleaming tower that made even Pinnacle's headquarters look modest by comparison. The conference room overlooked Lake Michigan, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with cold winter light that felt appropriate for the confrontation ahead. Pinnacle's legal team was led by Harrison Bradley Jr., a senior partner in his 60s who radiated the kind of casual arrogance that comes from decades of representing powerful clients against individual employees. He was accompanied by 3 associate attorneys, Pinnacle's general counsel, and surprisingly, Amanda herself. I hadn't seen Amanda since my termination, and sitting across from her in that sterile conference room felt surreal. She looked confident and professional in an expensive navy suit, completely comfortable in her role as the victim of unfounded accusations rather than the perpetrator of illegal retaliation. Bradley opened the meeting with what he clearly considered a generous settlement offer. "Ms. Martinez," he said, "my clients recognize that you've experienced a personal tragedy, and they're prepared to offer a substantial financial package to resolve this matter quickly and amicably." The offer was significant: 18 months of salary continuation, extended health benefits, and a reference letter that praised my professional contributions. In return, I would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and waive any right to pursue legal action or public criticism of Pinnacle. "That's a substantial offer for someone with no legitimate legal claim," Bradley continued. "Ms. Martinez was terminated as part of a planned departmental restructuring that had been under consideration for months before her father's death. Any suggestion that her termination was connected to her bereavement leave is simply factually incorrect. Elena responded with cool professionalism. Mr. Bradley, we appreciate Pinnacle's offer, but it doesn't address the fundamental issue here. Your client systematically violated Ms. Martinez's rights under Illinois employment law, and we have extensive documentation of that violation. She opened her briefcase and began laying out evidence methodically, email chains where Amanda questioned my commitment for asking about bereavement policies, recorded conversations where she explicitly threatened my career for prioritizing family over work, and witness statements from colleagues who'd heard her retaliatory comments. Furthermore, Elena continued, we have evidence that Ms. Martinez's experience wasn't isolated. We've identified at least a dozen current and former Pinnacle employees who faced similar retaliation for using family leave protections or requesting accommodations for personal responsibilities. Bradley's confidence flickered slightly as Elena continued presenting evidence. The recorded conversation where Amanda threatened my career was particularly damaging because it captured her exact words about how taking bereavement leave would be noted by senior management and would affect my career trajectory at Pinnacle. But Amanda herself seemed completely unrepentant. When Elena finished presenting our evidence, Amanda leaned forward and addressed me directly. Jessica, she said, her voice carrying the same condescending tone I remembered from our final phone call, I think you're misunderstanding what happened here. You were a valued employee who made a choice to prioritize personal matters over professional responsibilities during a critical business period. That choice had natural consequences. The audacity of that statement took my breath away. Amanda was sitting in a room full of lawyers, faced with overwhelming evidence of illegal retaliation, and she was still claiming that attending my father's funeral was a personal choice that deserved professional punishment. Amanda, I said, finding my voice for the first time since the meeting began, you're talking about my father's death like it was a vacation I chose to take during a busy week. You threatened my job for taking legally protected bereavement leave to bury the man who raised me. I never threatened your job, Amanda replied. I simply explained that professional success requires making difficult choices about priorities. The Morrison presentation was the most important project in our department's history, and your absence during that critical moment demonstrated that you weren't ready for senior leadership responsibilities. Elena interjected before I could respond. Ms. Walsh, are you seriously arguing that attending a parent's funeral disqualifies someone from leadership positions? Because that statement is being recorded, and it will be extremely useful evidence in our retaliation claim. Bradley quickly tried to control the damage. My client's personal opinions about work-life balance are irrelevant to the legal question of whether Ms. Martinez was terminated for legitimate business reasons. Actually, Jennifer said, speaking for the first time, your client's personal opinions are exactly what make this case so clear-cut. Ms. Walsh has just admitted, on the record, that she views family obligations as incompatible with professional advancement. That's textbook discrimination, based on familial status. For the next 2 hours, we presented the full scope of our evidence, the pattern of retaliation against employees with family responsibilities, the witness statements documenting Amanda's threats and discriminatory comments, and the medical documentation proving that my father's death was a genuine emergency requiring immediate family coordination. But the most devastating moment came when Elena presented evidence that Pinnacle's senior management had been aware of Amanda's discriminatory behavior and had chosen to enable it rather than enforce legal compliance. We have internal emails, Elena said, where human resources personnel discussed Ms. Walsh's aggressive management style and her tendency to pressure employees regarding personal time off. Senior management was specifically warned that Ms. Walsh's approach to family leave requests created legal liability for the company. Bradley and his team spent the lunch break huddled in urgent consultation. When we returned to the conference room, their strategy had shifted from denial to damage control. Ms. Martinez, Bradley said, my clients are prepared to significantly enhance their settlement offer in recognition of the unfortunate circumstances surrounding your departure from Pinnacle. The new offer was substantial, 36 months of salary continuation, full health benefits for 2 years, and a glowing reference letter that would support my efforts to find new employment. But it still required the same comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing Pinnacle's illegal behavior publicly. The offer also includes a commitment, Bradley continued, that Ms. Walsh will receive additional training on family leave policies and employee relations best practices. I looked at Amanda, who was staring at her hands and clearly hating every moment of this negotiation. The woman who'd threatened my career for grieving my father's death was now facing the prospect of court-ordered sensitivity training like a workplace discipline problem. Elena and Jennifer requested a private consultation to discuss the offer. In a smaller conference room down the hall, they laid out my options clearly. This is a very good financial settlement, Elena said. With 36 months of salary continuation, you'd have significant time to find new employment without financial pressure. The reference letter would help overcome any reputational damage from your termination. But, Jennifer added, accepting. This settlement means that Amanda and Pinnacle face no real consequences for their illegal behavior. The non-disclosure agreement prevents you from warning other employees about what happened, and it allows the company to continue retaliating against workers with family responsibilities. What if we reject the settlement and go to court? Then we're looking at 18 to 24 months of litigation, Elena explained. We'd almost certainly win based on the evidence we have, but the financial award might not be significantly larger than what they're offering now. And you'd spend 2 years of your life focused on this legal battle instead of rebuilding your career. Jennifer leaned forward. But there's a third option. We could file the class action lawsuit we've been discussing, representing all the Pinnacle employees who've faced similar discrimination. That case would take longer and be more complex, but it would create systemic change and prevent future employees from experiencing what you went through. I thought about Dad's letter, about his insistence that I not let companies abuse me, about his belief that standing up to bullies was the only way to stop them. I thought about Maria Santos and Carlos Mendez and all the other employees who'd been too scared or too financially vulnerable to fight back against Amanda's systematic cruelty. I want to reject the settlement, I said. I want to file the class action suit. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Elena smiled. Your father would be proud. When we returned to the main conference room, I stood up and addressed Bradley and Amanda directly. I'm rejecting your settlement offer, I said. What happened to me was illegal, and what you're doing to other employees is illegal. I'm not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement that allows you to continue retaliating against people for having families and personal responsibilities. Amanda's face flushed with anger. Jessica, you're making a huge mistake. You'll spend years in litigation and probably end up with less money than we're offering now. Maybe, I said. But I'll end up with my dignity intact, which is something you can't offer me. As we packed up our materials to leave, Bradley made one final attempt at intimidation. Ms. Martinez, I hope you understand that rejecting this generous offer means Pinnacle will defend itself vigorously against any future legal action. We'll examine every aspect of your employment history and your personal conduct. We'll make you prove that you deserved better treatment. I looked at him steadily. Mr. Bradley, I'm the daughter of a union mechanic who spent 40 years fighting for workers' rights. Making me prove I deserve basic human dignity is exactly the kind of fight I was raised to win. The confrontation was over, but the real battle was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.